I'll be right back. I excused myself from the table and headed towards the bathroom. Tonight, we were celebrating my 18th birthday. As I looked around the restaurant, I knew my parents probably saved for months to even afford the reservations for a place like this. As I pulled the door open to the bathroom, my jaw dropped. The person standing in front of me looked exactly like me. Hi, my name is Sharon. If you have not liked or subscribed yet to our channel, don't forget to do so. Also, tap that notification bell so that you will know when new content is posted. Hi, I'm Cassie. She moved aside for me to enter the bathroom. You look just like me. I looked at her in awe as though she were a legendary creature. I know, right? We really do resemble each other. You know they say that everyone in the world has a doppelganger. I nodded and smiled hesitantly. I have heard something like that. I guess we are the lucky ones to find each other. Cassie smiled. I know it's strange to ask, but do you think we could swap numbers? I just can't believe how much we look alike. I smiled. Sure, why not? Maybe we have more in common than we realize. I handed Cassie my phone to type in her number and she handed me hers. Thanks, I'll keep in touch. Have a good night. You too, I replied as she walked out the bathroom. I quickly used the bathroom and returned to my parents. I couldn't help but think about my meeting with Cassie. How weird was that? It also made me wonder if my parents were hiding anything from me that I should know about. One afternoon while finishing some assignments for my lecturer, my phone rang. It was Cassie. Hi, Cassie. How have things been? Things have been great. I wanted to call you so many times, but I didn't know what to say. I laughed. I was faced with the same thing, but I'm happy that you made the first move. We chatted for the next hour before Mom called me for dinner. During dinner, I asked my parents if I was adopted. Dad almost choked on the juice that he was drinking, and Mom patted his back and asked if he was okay.
Now, where did that question come from? Sharon, you aren't adopted, honey. You are our daughter,
Mom said. Then, do I have a twin I should know about?
I think I would have known if I gave birth to a twin, Sharon. Where's all this coming from?
A girl from my class this semester said that she recently found out that not only was she adopted, but she had a twin sister. I lied. Dad chuckled.
No need to worry about that over there, Sharon. You are our one and only.
The days that followed, Cassie and I spoke every day. I still had not told my parents about Cassie. I knew they wouldn't approve of me giving my number to a stranger. Cassie and I came from totally different worlds. She was wealthy and was next in line to take over her father's company, while my family was just barely making ends meet. Cassie didn't want to take over her father's company. She wanted to be an artist. I just wish my father could see how much I detest working in that company. It's so rigid and formal. If I don't get out of it, I think I might lose my mind. I wish he would allow me to become the artist that I want to be. Her father had his own furniture business where he imported the most unique types of furniture from around the world. You are so lucky, though. I mean, that type of furniture is a type of art. I love interior design. I wish I could just spend one day in that company. I'm sure I could get some gigs eventually to decorate. Maybe we can work something out, Cassie said thoughtfully over the phone. What do you mean? I was totally intrigued. What about if you swap places with me for a few hours at my dad's office? Don't worry about the clothes and shoes. I will provide everything you need to pull it off. But what if your dad finds out? Wouldn't he be upset? That's why we have to make sure that he doesn't. I will prep you for everything that happens at the office. What do you say? Is this a paying job? Sure it is. Great, then I'm in. The next day, I told my parents that I got a part-time job and it would just be a few hours a day. I felt a bit guilty not telling my parents the entire truth, but I knew that if I told them how I really got the job, they would want to meet Cassie and blow everything out of proportion as parents usually do. The first day of the job, I met Cassie at a little restaurant around the corner from her father's company. We went to the bathroom and she gave me a bag. I entered one of the stalls and quickly changed my clothes. When I came out, Cassie fixed my hair and makeup just like hers. We quickly went over the pictures of the people who worked in the company. After a few minutes, she looked at me. Are you ready? I nodded my head and together we walked out of the bathroom. As I entered the building, I greeted everyone exactly how Cassie taught me, even her dad. I fell into character quite easily, although I had to keep reminding myself that I needed to answer to the name Cassie and not Sharon. During the lunch break, I needed to use the bathroom when Cassie walked in. "What are you doing here? I thought we were going to meet at the restaurant," I blurted out. "I was too excited. I wanted to know how you were doing." Before I could respond, the door opened and Cassie pushed me into the nearest stall. I locked the door quickly.
Hi, Cassie. Just the person I wanted to see.
A female voice chimed.
Mr. Taylor wants to know if you made contact with the parents yet.
Cassie whispered to the woman her reply. I heard the bathroom door open and close. "Coast is clear. You can come out now." I came out of the stall. "I think I'll take it from here. You can change your clothes and I'll walk you out." After about 2 weeks and now spending the entire day at the company, Cassie had an idea. "How about if I spend a few hours with your family?" My heart dropped. Do I really want Cassie in my home? I mean, a company is one thing, but my home? Are you sure? I gave you an opportunity to work on the company of your dreams. Come on, everything is going to be okay. We can start with a few hours first. After some convincing, I went along with Cassie's plan. I think it may be a bit harder to pull one over on my parents, so we have to make sure that you don't forget anything. We did this back and forth, swapping for about 3 months, and it was great. One evening, while chatting with Cassie on the phone, she suggested a deal that blew my mind. What about if we swapped lives for real? I am willing to pay you $1 million for your identity. I am tired of living under my father's shadow. But if we do this, this has to be our little secret. You can't tell anyone, not even your parents. She agreed to give me time to think about it. That night, I thought about all the possibilities that $1 million could bring, but I also battled with not having to speak with my parents ever again. That night, I drifted off into a restless sleep. After a few days, I told Cassie that I would do it. Well, part of it anyway. She could have my identity for $1 million, but after everything my parents did for me, I was not ready to put them in my past. The night I left, I wrote my parents a letter. I told them about Cassie and everything that had happened in the last few months. I also told them about the $1 million deal. I told them to just play along since we could all benefit from this deal. The way I saw it was that I could help my parents with money every month and we could still find a way to keep in touch, unknown to Cassie. I left the letter in Mom's drawer while she was in the kitchen making dinner. After the dinner, I told my parents goodnight as they headed to their bedroom. Instead of heading to mine, I opened the door and allowed Cassie in while I closed the front door behind me on the way out. For the first 2 weeks, everything was great. I chatted with my parents almost every day without Cassie knowing. But then, everything went silent. I couldn't get in touch with my parents for a few days. I began to get worried. I went over to my parents' house, and when I got there, the door was slightly opened. I pushed it open slowly, and to my horror, the entire place was trashed. My stomach rotated as I noticed the writing on one of the walls. "I told you not to tell anyone." I immediately called the police and I told them that my parents were kidnapped. A few minutes later, they showed up at the house. I told them about everything that transpired over the past few months. We even went to where I worked and found nothing. The building was empty. How could this be? I was here this morning. I looked around in astonishment.
Ma'am, it could be that they have someone following you, and now that you came to your parents' house, they cleared out. We could spend the night outside your house if necessary. Do your parents have any enemies?
Not that I know of. Everyone loves my parents. I don't understand who would do this. The officer got a call. He spoke to the other person for a few seconds, then hung up and turned to me.
We ran the prints, and I think we should continue this at the station.
I nodded and hopped into my car and followed the officers to the station. When I entered the station, the officers called me into a room. I sat and waited, wondering what the problem was.
Sharon Harrington?
A tall, sturdy man walked into the room holding a file. Yes?
Hi, I'm Detective Deacon Willis. Let's get down to business. The prints that we found at the house belong to your parents and another woman named Blair Taylor.
The detective opened the file and placed 3 pictures in front of me. I recognized the first 2 pictures as my parents. They were younger then, but the third picture, I had no idea who it was. "Who is this?" I asked, pointing to the picture.
This is Cassie, otherwise known as Blair Taylor. You may recognize her like this.
The detective placed another picture on that table. It was a picture of the Cassie that I knew. But what's the link between Cassie and my parents? Why would she go through all this trouble to look like me?
Your parents betrayed Blair on their last robbery. They sold her out and got immunity and entered the witness protection program. Blair was released from jail about 2 years ago. We were tracking her till she fell off the radar about a year ago. We were never able to recover the money or jewels from the last heist that they did.
I was shocked beyond belief. My parents were robbers? Cassie wasn't really my doppelganger? So what do we do now? I asked as tears streamed down my face. It was my fault that my parents were missing. If only I told them about Cassie from the first night.
You go home and try to get some rest and let us do our jobs,
The detective said. I thanked him and exited the station. About 2 years later, after heading inside after coming home from work, I checked my mailbox. Inside was a photo album. I looked around to see if the person who dropped it off was still lurking in the area. I carried the album inside and opened it. In it was one picture of my parents and I, and a letter. In the letter, they explained that after the heist, they decided to go into the witness protection program to save me since Blair's husband, Joe, attempted to kidnap me. My parents also told me where the money and jewelry was stored with a list of names of people who would help me sell the jewels. My parents said to make sure I walked with a shovel and to go at night. I was a little taken back by this, but I continued to read. They said to save me, they decided to go back undercover because they couldn't risk anyone coming after me to get to them. They said that they had eyes on me and they would get in contact with me soon. The next day, I headed to the place where my parents said the money was stored. When I pulled up, I realized why my parents told me to walk with a shovel. The loot was hidden in a graveyard. I looked around to make sure no one was coming before I took out the shovel and looked for the name Annabelle Walker. I finally found the grave and I began to dig. I couldn't help but think that someone was looking at me. I looked over my shoulder and squinted into the shadows. The hairs on my neck rose, and I just wanted to get the loot and get out of here. I hit something hard, and I kneeled to scrape the rest of the dirt off the chest the money was in. The chest was small, but heavy. I dragged it out of the hole and quickly covered the hole. As I was walking away, I heard footsteps behind me, but I was too afraid to turn around. I walked as fast as my legs could carry me. When I reached my car, my heart raced as I noticed someone was leaning against it. I spun around, but the person who was chasing me was almost upon me.
Look, just take it. I don't want any trouble.
I placed the chest on the ground, held my breath, closed my eyes, and waited.
Hi, Sharon.
A familiar voice said. Mom? I rushed over and threw my arms around her neck. The person who was following me was my mother.
Let's get out of here. We have a lot of things to tell you.
I listened closely as muffled noises came from outside my bedroom door. Cautiously, I opened my bedroom door and peeked into the hallway. Before I knew what was going on, someone grabbed me and dragged me to the living room where my parents were already tied up and gagged. The masked men quickly tied me up and gagged me as well. One of them threw me over his shoulder, walked outside, and threw me in the back of a van and slammed the door. Hi, my name is Phoebe. Have you liked or subscribed to our channel yet? If not, what are you waiting for? I'll give you a second to do that. And of course to tap that notification bell, so you'll know when we post more videos. Did it? Great. Welcome aboard. Now, let's get back to my crazy story. The ride seemed endless. Eventually I woke up in a bedroom, a really nice bedroom. With silk curtains, expensive wooden furniture, and the tapestry on the walls looked priceless. It was even equipped with a television and cable. I banged on the door before I searched the room for another escape route, but the windows were nailed shut. There was another door in the room. I ran to it and pulled it open quickly, but my heart sank when I realized that it was a bathroom with a window too small for me to escape. After a few hours, I heard a key turning in the lock. When the door opened, there stood a girl, about 2 years older than I was, and behind her was 2 huge, intimidating-looking men. The girl placed the tray on the floor and waited for me to pick it up. When I refused, one of the men shoved me further into the room, kicked the tray with his foot, and slammed the door shut. Over the next few days, I played nice with the help. She told me that her name was Stephanie. She even came in a few times outside of mealtimes to chat with me. One afternoon, when I realized that I was alone, I hit her over the head with a bookend, ran out of the room, and quickly locked it behind me. Frantically, I looked for an escape route. I heard voices coming towards me from down the corridor. I saw an open window and quickly dove through it. A shrub broke my fall, which I quickly hid behind. I listened intently, and when I felt as though it was clear, I darted toward safety and decided to head to the police station. Upon arrival at the police station, I was met by a female officer.
Can I help you, ma'am?
I just escaped from my kidnapper. Did my parents make any report about my abduction? The officer took my name and told me to have a seat while she checked to see if there was a missing persons report that matched my name and description. A few minutes later, she called me to the counter.
Phoebe, there was no report made on your behalf.
There must be some sort of mistake.
Phoebe, is there someone that you want us to contact for you so they can come get you?
I gave the officer my parents' number. My mother answered first, and the officer put the phone on speaker.
Good afternoon. I would like to speak with Phoebe Mackenzie's parents, please. I am her mother. What is this about? Have you seen Phoebe in the last few days, ma'am? No, ma'am. I sent Phoebe to live with her aunt a few months ago when she began hanging with the wrong crowd. Her father and I thought a change of scenery would do her well.
The officer thanked my mother, hung up, and turned to me.
Phoebe, would you like me to call your aunt?
No thanks, I can get to her just fine. I turned and walked out of the police station. I didn't even have an aunt. Both my parents were only children. I was more confused now than I was a few days ago. That definitely didn't work out as I hoped it would. Were my parents involved in the kidnapping? But why? What did they have to gain? I knew I couldn't go back to my parents' house, but I needed answers. I decided that the only people who would tell me the truth are the people who kidnapped me in the first place. By the time I returned to my captures, it was nightfall. I knocked on the door and Stephanie opened it. I went to speak with the owners of this house, also known as my kidnappers. I brushed past Stephanie boldly. Are the masterminds of my kidnapping here? I yelled at the top of my voice. I was past my fear factor. I was now angry. How could my parents betray me like this? An elderly lady walked up to me.
Follow me, ma'am.
I was led to an office where I sat and waited. Shortly after, a middle-aged man and woman entered.
Good evening, Miss Phoebe. My name is Mr. Anard, and this is my wife, Mrs. Anard. One of our staff said you wanted to meet with us.
Why weren't you this polite when you and your goons kidnapped me?
I'm sorry, Miss Phoebe. My wife and I just returned from a trip. We did not know that you were kidnapped. We apologize if our men treated you roughly. You see, your parents sold you to us for $3 million to marry our son. We instructed our employees to bring you here safely.
My parents did what? Did they tell you that I'm only 17?
Your parents informed us of this,
Mrs. Anand smiled at me.
but they also said that you will be 18 in 6 months. Till then, you and our son can get to know each other.
What's wrong with your son that he can't find himself a wife? That his parents have to buy girls for him?
Our son
Mr. Anand walked towards me slowly, his voice soft and menacing.
got into a motorcycle accident a few years ago, and now he's in a wheelchair. Because of this handicap, nobody wants to marry him.
Feeling hurt and betrayed, I knew I had to make a choice. Let's make a deal. I will marry your son if you help me get back at my parents. No child should have to go through what I went through because their parents are looking for easy money. I will help you get back to $3 million from my parents and resplit it. Deal? Mr. Anand shook my hand firmly.
Deal.
I spent the night at my future in-laws and left at the crack of dawn the next day to head home to my parents. Mom! Dad! I knocked on the front door frantically when I arrived. When the door opened, Dad's tear-stained face welcomed me. He threw his arms around me and hugged me tightly. He helped me inside and asked me if I wanted breakfast, and I nodded. While Dad was preparing breakfast, Mom walked in. She looked at me and then walked towards Dad.
What is she doing here? You know the deal.
Dad grabbed Mom's arm and pulled her into the next room. He returned a few minutes later without Mom. Where's Mom?
She just needed some time alone.
Dad turned back to the stove and finished preparing breakfast. I didn't see Mom again until later that evening when the Anands called. She came to the living room where Dad and I were watching television and asked to talk with him in the kitchen. When they left for the kitchen, I eavesdropped on their conversation. When I thought the time was right, I bursted into the kitchen and demanded to know what was going on.
If you had stayed put, we wouldn't be in this predicament.
Mom pointed at me. I went to the police station after I escaped. Why didn't you tell the police about my kidnapping? Did you guys have something to do with it? Dad's face crumbled.
We needed money to get our daughter back.
I felt as though the room spun around me. I have a sister? Why didn't you tell me this before? Dad and Mom shared a look.
We adopted you when our Anita was snatched from us.
I felt my knees buckle below me, and I sank to the floor with my hand over my face as I burst into tears. My parents no longer wanted me because they found their daughter. Was I just a placeholder until they found their own flesh and blood?
You need to go back to the Anons. They're asking us to return the money since you are no longer there. We can't give back all the money because we already spent some of it. I tried to make a deal with them, but they are not buying it.
Mom shook her head at me.
Maybe we should go to the police and tell them the truth about what's going on.
Dad looked at Mom.
And tell them what? That we sold our adopted daughter to pay for the daughter they stopped looking for years ago? If we go to the police, they will lock us up and throw away the key. We are so close to getting Anita back, but she had to ruin it.
Mom slapped me. Dad pulled her away.
This isn't helping.
I walked to my room and locked the door. My only thoughts before drifting to sleep was to make my parents pay for what they did to me. By the time I woke up the next day, Mom and Dad had left the house. I took that time to search for any evidence of what their daughter looked like. I looked through Mom's laptop and I saw all the emails from the Anans. Mom had been planning this for months. There was one file in the laptop that I couldn't open. I called Mr. Anand, and he told me that he would send his son Kabir to help me unlock the file since he knew more about laptops than he did. I gave him directions to the coffee shop nearby and told him to tell Kabir to meet me there in 30 minutes. I went to the coffee shop with the laptop in hand, ordered a coffee, and waited for Kabir. After 15 minutes, a very handsome guy in a wheelchair rolled into the coffee shop. I walked over to him casually. "You must be Kabir."
What gave me away? Was it my thick tousled hair or my masculine physique?
I giggled. I found it hard to believe that Kabir needed his parents to arrange his marriage.
You must be Phoebe. It's nice to meet you.
We shook hands and we went to a table. I opened the laptop and showed Kabir the file that needed to be opened. I watched him intently as his fingers glided over the keyboard. After a few minutes, his fingers stood still and his eyes widened the more he stared at the screen. "What?" I turned the laptop towards me and my jaw dropped. It can't be. The girl in the picture may have been a few years younger, but it was her. My parents' daughter was Stephanie. I closed the laptop and made a lame excuse to Kabir that I needed to get the laptop back home before Mom got home. As I hustled home, I wondered if Kabir knew Stephanie's real identity and if he was just faking how shocked he was. The following day, I went to the Anands. Mr. and Mrs. Anand weren't home, so I decided to wait for them in the living room. I went to the bathroom, and when I came out, Kabir was in the room waiting for me. "I don't think that you should be here."
Look, I know why you ran away the other day at the coffee shop, but trust me, I had no idea that Stephanie was part of this. Tell me how I can help.
"We need to get Stephanie out of here and back to her parents." Kabir left the room and 2 minutes later walked in with Stephanie. I told her I knew where her real parents were and asked if she wanted to meet them. Stephanie nodded her head excitedly. Before leaving the room, Kabir surveyed the surroundings and quickly beckoned for us to follow him. Just as we were about to turn the corner, we heard voices, so we made a detour into the office. Stephanie and I squeezed under the table out of sight. My heart stopped when I heard the door open and Mr. Anand asked Kabir why he was in the office. Kabir said that he was dropping off some last-minute paperwork from Mr. Mohammed. Mr. Anand said that he had some work to finish, but Kabir convinced him that Mrs. Anand didn't want him to be late again for dinner. When everything was quiet once again, Stephanie and I snuck out of the office. I finally breathed a sigh of relief as the cold night air smacked my face. A car pulled up next to us and refroze. The window rolled down and Kabir was behind the wheel.
What, you never seen a guy in a wheelchair drive before? Hop in.
When we arrived to my parents' house, Stephanie and I jumped out. Stephanie twitched next to me. "Don't worry, they will love you."
Hey, Phoebe.
Kabir called. I went to the window and looked at him.
I'll be waiting here when you come out.
I nodded and walked into the house with Stephanie.
Mom! Dad!
I watched as my parents rushed over to Stephanie and threw their arms around her. During their reunion with her, I snuck into my room, emptied my book bag, and headed towards the office. As I stood in front of the safe, I prayed that my parents did not change the code. I looked up thankfully when I heard the beep. I opened the safe and took my passport, birth certificate, and all the money that was in the safe. I estimated it to be around $1 million. Once I emptied the safe, I snuck out the kitchen door. I looked at Kabir's car still parked at the front of the house and went in the opposite direction. I wasn't going to be in a forced marriage if I could do anything about it. I didn't even look back at my parents either. I moved to a small Caribbean island, and for a few years, I thought I was out of the woods. One Friday night, while I was walking out of a restaurant, I saw Kabir sitting close to the entrance. I hustled towards my car. I was able to get the key in the door when I heard tires screeching behind me, and a van door slid open. Someone threw a black case over my head and threw me into the van.
Phoebe, we have a wedding to plan.
Snip, snip, snip. The sound of the scissors cutting my long black hair echoed in my mind. This was the moment when I turned into a boy for money. My parents forced me to do it. But before I continue, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification button. Do this, and you will become the first millionaire in your family. Charlotte, Charlotte, my mother bolted through the door one afternoon. I was sitting at the dinner table helping my 7-year-old brother Jaden with his homework. "What's wrong, Mom?" I asked, startled by her sudden intrusion. "Guess what?" my mother said, and her eyes grew brighter as she spoke. "What?" I asked my mother. I simply detested guessing games since it usually turns into one of my parents telling me about their newest get-rich scheme. "Mr. James is coming to town," my mother squealed. "Who?" I asked. My brother chimed in, sounding a bit annoyed. "You are so lame. You know, the host of How Tough Are You?" How Tough Are You is a game show that recruits teenage boys and puts them through a series of tasks. I hated watching that show since it usually ended up with one of the boys eating something gross like a slug or putting their hands into something like a container filled with spiders. "So why are you excited about that?" I asked, puzzled. "You are going to be on the show," my mom exclaimed. My jaw dropped open. "What? How am I going to be on the show? That show is only for boys. I'm not a boy." "Not yet, you're not," my mother said. I tried to find out what she meant, but she refused to answer. I was twisting and turning in bed when my dad got home. I heard muffled conversation coming from the TV room. I snuck out of bed and hid in the shadows as I eavesdropped on my parents' conversation. "I'm telling you, John, we struck gold this time," my mother said excitedly. "Do you think she could pull it off?" my dad said, stroking his chin. "She doesn't have the shape or figure of an age 15 girl. We could use that to our advantage. All she needs to do to seal the deal is cut her hair," my mother said. I placed my hand over my mouth to stifle the cry that tried to escape. I tiptoed back to my room with tears in my eyes. How dare they bring me into one of their get-rich-quick schemes? That night, I contemplated running away, but then I thought about Jaden and the fact that he might end up just like our parents, jumping from one scheme to the next. I had to stay for him. The next day, my dad called a family meeting. "Okay, Charlotte and Jaden," my father said with a broad smile on his face. "Your mother came up with a brilliant idea." My stomach turned as I sat and waited for my parents to tell me what their plan was for me. "We decided that Charlotte will be a contestant on How Tough Are You?" my father said as he came over and patted me on the back. "Charlotte?" my brother said, looking at me sideways. "The same Charlotte that's afraid of lizards, roaches, and every creepy crawling thing under the sun?" My brother curled up in a ball, clutching his belly as he rolled around laughing at my demise. "And what makes you think that I want to do this?" I asked my parents boldly, looking them in the eyes. "Oh, honey," my mother said as she sat next to me and held my hands. $5 million! Think of what $5 million can do for us. $5 million or 5 years in prison if they find out that I lied about being a boy, I scoffed. "Listen, your mother and I spoke about this last night, and we decided that if you win, we will stop trying to come up with ways to get rich quick," my father said. "Fine," I said reluctantly. The next day was a casting call for contestants. That night, I sat in a puddle of my cut hair, holding a jockstrap, wondering if I made a mistake. My name was no longer Charlotte, but Charlie. The next day, we went on set. There were about 50 boys lined up waiting to enter the studio. After a grueling interview process, 19 boys, including myself, were chosen. I couldn't believe that I pulled it off. "Congratulations, boys, you are officially contestants on How Tough Are You?" Mr. James exclaimed. After the interview, I asked a staff member for directions to the washroom. I almost headed into the ladies' washroom, but quickly made a detour to the men's. I hesitated before I entered. There were 2 boys using the urinals. I felt my face redden because they were just peeing right there, right in front of each other. I quickly entered a stall. I waited until I was sure they were gone before using the bathroom. When I was finished, I washed up quickly and rejoined my family. "Okay, parents, it's time to say goodbye to your sons," Mr. James said. "The next time that you see them, you and your family may be millionaires. Follow me as we will need you to sign contracts for your sons. This way," Mr. James said and walked off. I hugged my parents and my brother goodbye before being ushered away. That night, we had a feast. There were 6 tables piled with foods, desserts, and drinks. I watched as the other boys laughed and mingled with each other. I sat in a corner picking up my food, wondering how I was going to pretend to be a boy for 2 weeks. After the feast, we were paired up. There were 2 boys per room. Mr. James told us that the person we were paired up with would be our teammate for the duration of the contest. I was teamed up with a boy named Karen. He seemed kind of shy. I was happy when he didn't ask me any questions when we got to our room, as I was too worried about what would take place over the next 14 days. The blare of a trumpet woke us up the next morning. A big, brawny man opened the doors and switched on the lights in the rooms. The groans of the boys sounded in the hallway.
"It's 5 a.m. That means it's time to wake up,"
he said over a megaphone.
"If you look at the base of your beds, you will see 7 track pants and 7 t-shirts. This will be your uniform for the next 14 days. You have 5 minutes to get dressed and get out of bed, or you will be disqualified."
I panicked silently. How am I supposed to get dressed when Karen is in the room? To my surprise, Karen grabbed his clothes and headed to the tiny bathroom in the chambers without a word. I dressed quickly before Karen came back.
"You have 1 more minute,"
the man said. I rushed to the hallway without even brushing my teeth. I gagged. Is this what the next 14 days are going to be like? At the end of the 5 minutes, all 20 boys were outside their doors waiting for instructions. The big, brawny man introduced himself as Mr. Marshall. He told us that every exercise we did from this time forward, we would obtain a score.
"Now, let's go for a jog,"
Mr. Marshall said as he led us to a big field at the back of the studio.
20 laps, let's go. You must cross the 20 laps with your partner, otherwise it doesn't count."
He blew the whistle around his neck and the boys took off. As I began to run, I saw Karen fell into step next to me. "Pace yourself," he said. "Stay with me and you'll be fine." That morning, not only did we have to run 20 miles, but we had to do an obstacle course. I felt as though I was in boot camp for bad behaved teens. During the last stretch of the obstacle course, my leg got caught in the rope bridge that I was climbing. I watched as Karen sprinted ahead of me. "Karen, wait!" I shouted. Karen stopped and looked around and sprinted back to me. "Keep still," he said calmly as he untangled my leg. "Okay, let's go," he said as soon as the rope was loose. We crossed the line in 6th place. "Sorry," I said as I dashed a bottle of water over my face to cool myself down. "That's okay. That's what teammates are for." He smiled at me. For the first time since entering the competition, because of Karen, I felt that I would be able to make it till the last day of the competition. Over the next few days, Karen and I got closer. At nights, we would plan our strategies based on what we remembered from previous recordings of the show. Each day that passed, contestants were sent home. Some of the challenges were sitting in a bathtub with frogs, drinking raw eggs, drinking pureed bugs, jogging in socks, then placing your partner's sock in your mouth. The worst challenge for me was sucking worms off Karen and spitting them in a bowl. Day 13. That night, there were only 3 contestants left for the finale. Myself, Karen, and Marlon. Even though there were other rooms available, Karen and I still shared a room. I realized that I was starting to have feelings for Karen. He was just so kind and funny, and I knew I could always rely on him. That night, while chatting with him, I impulsively leaned forward and kissed him. I figured, hey, that was my last night with him, so I may as well shoot my shot. Nothing could prepare me for what happened next. Karen wiped his lips and said, "I'm sorry, Charlie, but I'm not gay." I giggled. "I'm not a boy, silly. I'm really a girl." There I was on the last night of the game show and spilling my guts about who I really was. Was I insane? "Well, I'm not a boy either," Karen said and smiled. My brain was trying to comprehend what I just heard. "You what?" I asked again. "I'm not a boy," he whispered. "My name is Carrie Ann McIntosh. It's nice to meet you." Karen, or should I say Carrie Ann, extended her hand to me. I shook it. "Hi, my name is Charlotte Lewis," I whispered. We exchanged stories about how we ended up on the show. Unlike me, Carrie Ann enjoyed the show and would never miss an episode when it aired. Her grandmother needed the money for surgery, and this was the only way that her family could afford it. "Let's make a pact," she said. "If either one of us wins, we share the money." "Deal," I said as I shook her hand firmly. Then I began to laugh. "What are you laughing at?" Carrie Ann asked, bewildered. "I can't believe that I kissed a girl," I shrieked. Day 14. Finally, it was the last day of the contest. All parents and past contestants were invited to be the studio audience. "Good luck," I said and gave Carrie Ann a big hug. "May the best girl win," she said as she hugged me back. We walked into the studio wondering what the final task would be. "Good morning to our studio audience. Today, we will see which one of these brave boys will be going home with $5 million, Mr. James said. The audience applauded and shrieked. I looked up in the audience and saw my parents, but I didn't see Jaden. "Okay, contestants. There are 3 curtains in front of you. Karen, curtain 1, Marlon, curtain 2, and Charlie, curtain 3. Mr. James said as he pointed in the direction of the curtains. "Okay, let's raise the curtains and show our contestants what their final challenge today will be," Mr. James said dramatically.
A hushed silence spread over the audience. A look of horror washed over my face when I saw what was behind the curtain. Jaden! Jaden was tied to a chair. His mouth gagged, and in front of him were snakes. Very large snakes. My blood ran cold. Okay, contestants, the first one to release their victim and bring them back to safety wins. The snakes are sound asleep. Mr. James checked the watch on his hand. You have at least 3 minutes before they wake up. Buzz! The bell rang and I inched into the makeshift corridor to save my brother. I barely had enough space between the snakes to place my feet. I was halfway down to Jaden when I felt something move against my leg. I saw the 15 short years of my life flash before my eyes. I was paralyzed. I wanted to save Jaden, but I was too afraid to move. Suddenly, a voice shouted, "Go, Charlie, go! You can do this!" It was Carrie Ann. I inhaled quickly and mustered every ounce of courage that I had and made my way to Jaden. "Way to go, Charlie!" Jaden beamed with pride as I released him from his bondage. "Come on, hop on," I said, stooping down a bit so that Jaden could hop onto my back. I slowly made my way back to where I began. Jaden hopped off and Carrie Ann gave me a high five. "Way to go, bro," she said as she winked at me. "The time that we have all been waiting for is here. The results of the contest. Who is going home $5 million richer today?" Mr. James opened the envelope that was in his hand and continued. "The winner is Karen McIntosh." The audience cheered and balloons and confetti rained down on us. I watched as Carrie Ann received her check and posed for pictures. I was relieved that it was finally over. My parents rushed down from the audience and hugged me. They apologized for forcing me to go on the show, and they vowed to never put me or Jaden in harm's way again. My parents followed me into the chamber so I could retrieve my things. A few minutes after, Carrie Ann showed up and we introduced our families. In hushed whispers, Carrie Ann told her parents about the deal we made. They agreed to share the money and thanked me for keeping their daughter's secret. I'm happy to say that my parents were true to their word. They never took part in another get-rich scheme. That year I may have lost my hair, but I gained something much, much more. To this day, Carrie Ann and I still chat, but we never told anyone how we truly met.